This video is going to deal with Chapter 19, State and Local Government. What we're going to do in this chapter is just take a real quick look at some of the similarities and differences that exist between the federal government and the governments that exist in each of the 50 states. And the first thing that we need to remember in going into this discussion is the concept of federalism. We need to take a look again real quick at what federalism means. Under a federal form of government, there is what we call shared sovereignty. Sovereignty is held by the federal government in some situations, and it's held by the state government in some situations. The ultimate authority over an issue is sometimes going to set with the state government, and it's sometimes going to set with the federal government. And what we have to realize is that each of the 50 states are set up slightly different. Federalism allows the states to organize their state government in pretty much any manner in which they like. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Constitution really only has one thing to say about the structure of state government. What it says is that the states will guarantee their citizens a republican form of government. Article 4, Section 4 says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. What that means is this country will have state governments whose government is based on a representative democracy. Every citizen in the state will have the legitimate right to help choose the leaders that will make the decisions for their state. It's really the only restriction that's placed on the state governments as far as what their structure will look like. Now, keeping that in mind, we'll notice that different states look different. Some states have a court system that has 2 levels. Most states have a court system that has 3 levels. Every state in the Union has the 3 branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and judicial branch. Now, they don't have those 3 levels or branches of government because the U.S. Constitution says they have to. Every state chooses to have those 3 branches of government because that's the way they want to be organized. What those 3 branches look like will vary from state to state. And it varies from state to state because each individual state in the United States has a constitution that regulates what their state government will look like and how it will act. Some states give their citizens some very direct influence and power over things like legislation and who will remain in office and who won't. Some states give their citizens a lot more of what we call direct democracy, and some states don't. So you can move from California to North Carolina and be in a very different state government situation. And what we want to do is we want to look at some of the major similarities and differences between the federal government and the state governments. And we will particularly look at 3 aspects of government in which we compare the federal government to the state government. And those 3 areas that we're going to talk about is we're going to look at constitutions. U.S. Constitution versus state constitutions. We're going to look at the branches of government. We're going to look at how those branches are organized. And then we're going to look at something called citizen participation. How involved in the governing process do states allow their citizens to be, as opposed to how involved in the governing process does the federal government allow citizens to be. We're going to take a look at all 3 of these aspects and compare and contrast the federal government to the state government. The first aspect of state governments that we want to compare with the federal government are constitutions. As we know, the U.S. government is basically guided by the U.S. Constitution. It sets out the basic guidelines by which the federal government will operate. When we look at the U.S. Constitution, as we've said over and over during the semester, it is a relatively vague document. The U.S. Constitution only has a total of 4,500 words. including the signatures of the men who signed it in 1789. Now, when we include the 27 amendments, now the U.S. Constitution has a total of 8,700 words. But still, that is nothing when we look at the fact that the average state constitution has 26,000 words, which means the state constitution on average is 3 times as long as the U.S. Constitution. Now, there's several reasons for this, and the primary reason is this idea of shared federalism. We talked about there being a stack of powers or issues that the federal government has sovereignty over, and there being a stack or pile of powers in which state government has sovereignty over. If you remember our conversation, the powers or the issues over which state government is supposed to have sovereignty is tremendously larger than that of the federal government. Remember the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution said any issue or matter not specifically addressed in the U.S. Constitution becomes a power of the state. So there are many, many, many things that the U.S. Constitution doesn't talk about specifically that falls into the realm of state sovereignty. So the state constitutions have evolved into documents that are much more detailed than the U.S. Constitution. The United States government, or the federal government, tends to deal with the specific issues that need to be addressed by writing laws, which are separate from the U.S. Constitution. A lot of times, states will amend their constitution to address certain issues. For example, Missouri several years ago decided to allow stem cell research. And instead of simply passing a law allowing stem cell research, we had a state constitution amendment that addressed the issue of stem cell research. So state constitutions tend to be much, much more detailed and therefore much less flexible. When we look at the average state constitution has been rewritten several times, whereas the U.S. Constitution from 1789 till today has never been rewritten. It has been amended 27 times, but it has not ever been rewritten. Now that brings up the second issue when we deal with constitutions. The U.S. Constitution has been amended 27 times, whereas the average state constitution has been amended many, many more times. Now let's look at this whole issue of the United States Constitution and these 27 amendments. There really hasn't, in my opinion, when we describe this, there really hasn't been 27 significant changes to the U.S. Constitution. And the reason I say that is because when we look at the U.S. Constitution and the 27 amendments, 10 of them took place immediately after it was put into effect. So really those 10 amendments can really be looked at as either one amendment, or really those 10 amendments could have been done before the Constitution was ever ratified, and they never really showed up as amendments. But we chose to wait to do it until right after the Constitution was ratified. And then we have the first 10 amendments, which is almost a third of the total amendments. Now, and the 27th amendment, the last amendment we have, that amendment was actually suggested when the first 10 amendments were suggested. But it took over 200 years for the 27th Amendment, which deals with the salaries of members of Congress, from actually being ratified. So if we take the 27th and kind of lump it together with the others, then we're really down to, what, 27 minus 11 is what, or 16? And then you've got the 18th and the 21st Amendments that really nullify each other. The 18th Amendment creates prohibition, outlaws alcohol, and the 21st repeals the 18th. So we can throw those out. So really when we look at this, there have only been 14 significant amendments to the U.S. Constitution. In my opinion, over the past 200 and some odd years that the document has been in effect, having to amend it only 14 times is a pretty good indicator that the document that was written was a pretty solid document. And a lot of the reason we haven't had to amend it is because we've chosen to use vague words. Like when we talk about the Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. They chose to use that very broad word, interstate commerce. Commerce is a broad word. They could have said, when they wrote the Constitution, Congress will have the right to regulate all trade done by sailing ship or by horse and buggy. If they had been that specific, then every time a new invention would have come along, they would have had to amend the Constitution to give Congress the right to regulate that new type of commerce. And when we look at state constitutions, the average state constitution has been amended 115 times, which means that there are some state constitutions that have been amended less than that, and there are other state constitutions that have been amended many more times than that. The Alabama state constitution, it's the longest state constitution in the country, 172,000 words. It has been amended over 770 times. My prediction is that not too much longer, the state of Alabama is going to have to rewrite that document. Because when you have 770 amendments, it becomes very difficult to read that original document, especially since some of those amendments to the state constitution is actually amendments to the state constitution. And it gets very, very difficult. The two primary reasons that state constitutions are amended much more frequently is, one, the length of the document, and the second thing is that the average state constitution makes the process of amending state constitutions much easier. When we look at amending the U.S. Constitution, it requires 2/3 of each House of Congress to suggest an amendment. And then after that, which is very difficult to do in and of itself, then you have to have 3/4 of the states agree to ratify it. So it's a supermajority just to get the amendment proposed, and it's another supermajority of the states to get it ratified. Whereas at the state, basically what happens is it requires a supermajority in each house, 2/3 in each house of the state legislature. A majority of the voters then have to ratify it. And a majority is just 50.1%, while for the U.S. amendment to be ratified, it takes 75% of the states to agree. So the process for amending the U.S. Constitution is much more difficult than it is for states. And a last thing about amending state constitutions is a number of states in the United States allow voters to start the process of changing this Constitution. At the national level, generally the way a constitutional amendment is started is members of Congress do it. And if Congress doesn't choose to start the process, we don't deal with the constitutional amendment. Whereas a lot of states give their citizens something we call constitutional initiative, where some citizens in the state come up with an idea for the amendment to the Constitution. And then the people in the state get to vote on that idea that a private citizen came up with. In a lot of cases, the legislature is completely left out of the amendment process. The states that allow that, we're going to tend to see more constitutional amendments. And understand that each state has their own constitution, and each state can establish the Constitution or put things in the Constitution that they choose. They're not under very much obligation by the U.S. Constitution on what types of things have to be put in a state constitution. The only thing that the U.S. Constitution says about state governments is that the state government must be created based on the concept of representative democracy, or a republic form of government. The next part of state government that we would like to compare with the federal government is the actual structure of the government. Every one of the 50 states has created a government with 3 branches. All of the states use the same 3 branches as the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Also, all states have governors as their chief executives. Every one of the states in the Union has a state legislature. Now we'll take a look at state legislatures, and they vary a little bit. But every state uses a state legislature. And all states, as we've talked about in previous chapters, all states have their own court system. The major differences between the court systems are things like how is it structured, how many levels are there, and how are the judges picked. We're going to take a look at all three of these issues. We're going to take a look at all three of these branches. We're going to look at what the executive branch tends to look like at the state. We're going to look at how the legislative branches tend to look at the state, and how judicial branches look. The first thing, state executive branches. As the president is the chief executive of the federal government, all states have made the chief executive of their state the governor. Now, a major difference between the governor as the chief executive of the state and the president as chief executive of the country is that, as we talked about in the last chapter, the Constitution gives all executive power to the president. The president is the only member of the executive branch that is directly elected, of course, except for the vice president. But everybody else in the executive branch basically reports to the president. They get their job because the president has appointed them, and the Senate, for the most part, has confirmed them. So the president has all executive power at the federal level. As Harry S. Truman said, with the plaque on his desk, the buck stopped with him, which means any decision made in the executive branch at the federal level ultimately was his responsibility. Now, at the states, it's somewhat different. The states, when they originally created their constitutions, made very weak governors. They didn't want their governor to be a very powerful person at the state level. Many states created governors that only served 1 year and could not, succeed themselves. Governors were just kind of paper pushers. The executive branch in most states are made up of a number of elected people. As we look at the state of Missouri, for example, in the executive branch, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, the state treasurer, the state auditor, all of these people are independently elected. So none of these people in this list owe their job to the governor. So each of these individuals in this list in the executive branch is independent. So executive power at the state level is spread out amongst many different people. It makes the governor much less powerful at the state level than the president is at the national level. In recent history, governors have become more powerful because they are the person at the top of the state government structure. And they are the person who kind of coordinates the policies at each different executive agency. Also, the governors have gained power over the years because the governor is the one who submits budgets. The governor will submit a budget to the state legislature explaining what he thinks the Attorney General's office should get and what the Secretary of State's office should get. So that gives the governor some power. But it must be clearly understood that the governor at the state level is much less powerful as a chief executive than the president is as the chief executive at the national level. The next thing that we want to look at is state legislatures. Again, all states have state legislatures, and they operate similar to the way Congress operates. They all have power to make laws, appropriate money, and they generally act as the representatives of the people. Each state themselves gets to decide how large the state legislature will be. Missouri has 163 members of their state House of Representatives and 34 members of their state Senate. Now, Illinois, on the other hand, has 80-something members of their Senate and 100-something members of their State House of Representatives. Each state gets to decide the size of their state legislature. And that will be laid out and explained in the state constitution. Now, 49 of the 50 states have a state legislature that looks almost exactly like the national legislature. It's bicameral. Nebraska is the only state that has a unicameral legislature. The state of Nebraska used to have a bicameral legislature, but at some point in time, the state of Nebraska decided they didn't need a state House of Representatives. So they only have a state Senate. Again, that's a choice they make, because as long as their government is based on a Republican form of government, they can structure their state legislature however they want to. The state legislatures are becoming more like Congress in that many state legislatures have now what we call professional legislators. These people, it's the only job they have. But there are other states who have legislators who are only part-time. They only work, a couple of months a year. Missouri is a good example of a state that has a part-time legislature. When our state senator, Jason Crow, is not in Jeff City working, he works as a lawyer. And he's only up in Jeff City working for a couple of months out of the year. Other states like California have full-time legislatures, because California is the largest state in the union population-wise. They've got a very complicated system, and they need legislators that are going to work full-time. Salaries for legislators vary. In California, state legislators make over $100,000 a year. In states like Wyoming, Texas, and New Hampshire, where they're smaller states and they're only part-time legislators, some of them make less than $10,000 a year. Again, that is a decision that the state gets to make. And then the last thing we need to know about state legislators or state legislatures is some states place term limits on their state legislatures and some don't. Some states say their state legislators can only serve 8 years, and then they're done. Missouri says you can serve 8 years in the State House of Representatives and 8 years in the State Senate. But other states are like the U.S. legislature, like Congress. Some states say members of our state legislature can serve as long as they like. It all depends on what the states want. Right now, about half of the states place term limits on state elected officials, and particularly state legislators.